Good morning. My name is Neil Shader, and I am the Press Secretary for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Today, we will be reviewing the seismic events that occurred in April 2016 in Lawrence County, in northwestern Pennsylvania. Today, we will be joined by Acting Secretary Patrick McDonald, Seth Pilepko, Chief of the Division of Well Plugging and Subsurface Activities, and Harry Wise, Licensed Professional Geologist in the Subsurface Activities section of the DEP's Oil and Gas Management Program. I'll first hand it over to Acting Secretary McDonald for a brief summary of the Lawrence County seismic events. Then we'll hear from Seth Pilepko, who will give us an overview of seismicity and then discuss the findings and recommendations of the DEP report on the events. Finally, we will take questions from accredited media. Reporters on the call, please type your questions into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner, and please list the name and the media you are affiliated with. Because of the high participation in today's call, we are accepting questions from reporters only. As a quick housekeeping note, this report is available on DEP's website, and a recording of this webinar will be made available. The slides from the presentation are also available on the DEP website. And with that, I will hand it over to Secretary McDonald.
Thank you, Neil, and thanks for everybody for participating in the webinar. I'll walk through a brief summary of what actually occurred. The base issue is several low magnitude earthquakes occurred in Lawrence County during the morning hours of April 25th, 2016. Was located in Mahoning, North Beaver, and Union Townships, just west of Newcastle. The magnitudes we were looking at were 1.8 to 2.3 on the Richter scale. And since the seismic events were recorded and felt only by seismometers, they were considered microseismic. Our analysis, after doing the review, and you'll hear more detail about that in a moment, is that these events are correlated with the activity of the operator. Induced seismicity is a relatively new and complex technical issue. Our report on the Lawrence County seismic events of April 2016 reflect our commitment to understand what occurred through extensive review with scientific and industry partners, and importantly, to formulate procedures to reduce seismic risk going forward. Before we move on, I do in particular want to just thank the staff of the Oil and Gas Program for the work that they did in reviewing and understanding these events so that we can be better positioned on a going forward basis to deal with such issues. I'll now turn it over to Seth Pilepko to walk you through the events and our review in more specific terms. Seth?
Thank you to the Acting Secretary McDonald and also to our Press Secretary, Mr. Shader. I'd also like to acknowledge the time and effort of Mr. Craig Lobin's oil and gas team in Meadville and professional geologist, Mr. Harry Wise, for all the effective coordination that's really gone on since day one of this incident. That work has enabled us to share these findings with you today and to develop a thorough forward plan for managing these matters in the state as we move forward, as the Secretary indicated. To understand the significance of the Lawrence County events, it's first important, I think, to step back and discuss some fundamentals related to seismology, which is essentially the study of earthquakes. So I'm going to provide some of this background information for everyone before we return specifically to the discussion of the Lawrence County events of April 2016. As an overview, this slide that we're looking at now presents the Richter scale, which is essentially the way we measure earthquake magnitude, along with narrative descriptions of what might expect to experience at the surface if an earthquake falls into one of these magnitude categories. As you'll note, the magnitude as measured on the Richter scale and the associated energy release when an earthquake takes place ranges from events that can't be felt at the surface, microseismic events, to events that can actually cause significant damage to structures. I think it's important to reiterate that the Lawrence County events were all categorized as microseismic events, meaning they were all less than a magnitude of 3. It's also important to recognize that, among other things, the magnitude of an earthquake often corresponds to the size of the fault that has moved to trigger the earthquake. In essence, larger faults can release greater amounts of energy and produce large earthquakes. This slide provides a visual overview of natural seismicity in Pennsylvania that extends back to 1724. Modern recording of seismic events in the Commonwealth has predominantly been managed by the United States Geological Survey since around 1970. In this figure, the size and color of the symbols indicate the magnitude of recorded events on the Richter scale. One well-known fact about earthquakes is that by study and reference to historical information, it is often possible to identify areas that are more susceptible or at risk to an event. The timing, of course, is something that can't be predicted with a high degree of certainty. Generally speaking, in Pennsylvania, we see two seismically active zones in the state that are pretty well defined, one in southeastern Pennsylvania, shaded in red, and one to the northwest, shaded in blue. Just for some context here, the southeastern belt of earthquake activity is associated with Triassic rift basins. Essentially, this is where the continent was pulling apart at one time in geologic history. If you look to the northwest, there's also some increased activity, seismic activity, and this has generally been attributed to glacial retreat and rebound in the area in and around Lake Erie. This is another event in geologic history. So the Lawrence County events occurred in this seismically active, previously glaciated area. Note that there are very few 0 to 1 magnitude events recorded in Pennsylvania during the period represented on this map. One reason is the limited number of seismometers that have historically been in place throughout the Commonwealth. Essentially, to record very small earthquakes, a seismometer needs to be relatively close to the event. In summary here for this slide, it's safe to conclude that as a general note, very few earthquakes greater than 3 occur within Pennsylvania. Only 12 tectonic events were recorded by the United States Geologic Survey between 1970 and 2015. Other sporadic tectonic events in recorded history have occurred before this period and dating back to 1724. Generally, earthquakes with magnitudes less than 3 are only felt by seismometers, as we reviewed on the previous slide. Such earthquakes do not cause damage at the surface. So although the majority of earthquakes are concentrated in southeastern northwestern corners of the state, there are other fault systems throughout Pennsylvania which may move to produce earthquakes. In general, these are smaller fault systems. The terminology and classification scheme for seismic events provides a useful reference for placing the Lawrence County events in an appropriate context. First, seismic events can be subdivided into 2 major categories, tectonic and non-tectonic. A non-tectonic seismic event would be an event that doesn't occur by normal Earth processes. Often these are identified by something known as a waveform analysis, where a seismologist or trained individual looks at the pattern of seismic waves caused by the event. Tectonic seismic events are identified by normally occurring Earth processes, such as movement along a fault. These processes can be further subdivided into natural or induced events. So using this classification scheme, the Lawrence County event is properly classified as an induced tectonic seismic event. There is a great deal of current research being dedicated toward understanding the factors that cause induced tectonic seismicity. It's certainly important for Pennsylvania to stay engaged on this matter, and we have been. This is particularly important due to the recent history of induced events in other states, such as Oklahoma and Ohio. Although it's important to caution against direct comparisons to other parts of the United States, or even the world for that matter, as geology, of course, changes from area to area. And this work has to be done carefully by individuals with expertise in the subject area. Although induced tectonic seismicity has been noted and associated with deep well disposal, historically deep well injection, it should be noted that the study of induced seismicity in current oil and gas development context is a relatively new science, and research groups are just starting to gain a clearer understanding of contributing factors and to develop guidance. Ongoing research is being initiated by academia, federal and state agencies, and cooperative industry groups. Understanding triggering mechanisms for induced seismicity is based on a review of current research and studies and through coordination with regulatory partners. So let me just walk through a couple of the factors that are important. We'll talk about this concept of brittle rock fracture. In other words, rock layers don't really bend or flex. They would tend to break. And so when that happens, we do see seismic activity. Pressure changes can also create a mechanism that allows for fault movement. Changes in pressure near active faults can be induced by man-made activities. Active faults need to be properly oriented in the existing stress field to allow for movement along a fault. This is really a more technical concept, But if the existing stress in the earth is holding a fault together, it really can't move even when there are human activities that are taking place nearby. Finally, crystalline basement rocks, which are brittle in nature, cannot readily accommodate changes in stress or strain or pressures. The origin of induced tectonic seismic events in certain areas appear to be associated with crystalline basement rock. It has generally been noted by researchers that the greater the vertical separation between this basement crystalline rock and the activity, the less likely that an induced event will occur. Evidence of the presence of some of these contributing factors can be identified in association with the Lawrence County event, as later slides will show. To follow up on a point made during the last slide, DEP technical staff developed a color-coded map that compares the Utica shale depth to the depth of crystalline basement rock. Red areas on the map indicate portions of the state where the Utica shale is closer to basement rock, let's say on the order of 4,000 vertical feet or less. As you can see, the basement rock in Lawrence County is comparatively shallow relative to some other places in the state where unconventional drilling and hydraulic fracturing is taking place in the Utica shale. To speak to the Lawrence County event with more specificity, the Utica shale, which was being hydraulically fractured at the time the Lawrence County events were measured, is roughly at 7,900 feet below the surface. Basement rock in this area is roughly at 9,500 to 10,000 feet, so we're talking about a separation distance of approximately 2,500 to 3,000 feet. I think it's significant to ask how Pennsylvania currently monitors for seismic events in the Commonwealth. Seismic event detection capabilities in Pennsylvania have not always permitted low magnitude event detection statewide. We talked about this a little bit earlier. There simply were not enough seismometers to resolve those really low magnitude events that can't be felt. The state has committed financial resources to improve seismic event detection over the last several years. Currently, the state's network, which is known as PA-SEIS, is operated by Penn State University. PA-SEIS data relating to earthquakes are available to the public via the web. There's also the Lamont Doherty and USGS networks, which are smaller networks that operate in the state. Data is shared among all these organizations. Pennsylvania has established a number of working contacts with researchers and regulatory personnel across the western border with Ohio. 2 networks are in operation in Ohio. Seismic events, of course, are not limited to detection within the borders of the state. Having nearby seismometers helps with more accurate estimates of earthquake position on a map, position at depth, and magnitude. As mentioned during the previous slide, the state has dedicated funds to monitoring earthquake activity in Pennsylvania. This slide is part of a dynamic pair, but the first one in this series will show you where the seismic network was situated around 2010. This network has been enhanced over time. More specifically, a number of temporary stations that were in the state that were added during a baseline study of seismicity completed by Penn State in 2000-2014 have now been converted to permanent stations. It was decided to make many of these temporary stations, as I said, permanent, so the network by the summer of 2016 now looks more like the current slide. There are 41 seismic monitoring stations that exist throughout the state. The end result is that even in areas of the Commonwealth where the ability to detect events at its lowest, the magnitude of completeness, which essentially is the lowest event that can be detected in the area of the state with the poorest or lowest resolution, is much lower than it once was. So, for instance, during the Penn State study in 2000, 2013, and 2014, the magnitude of completeness was about 1.8, which again is well below that benchmark of 3 for felt events. This number is currently being re-estimated for the permanent station locations that were chosen, but it is expected to be 2 or better. Again, remember that the threshold for felt earthquake events is approximately 3 on the Richter scale. It's also important to mention that events below the magnitude of completeness can, and in fact are, detected if the configuration of nearby stations provides sufficient resolution. It is safe to say, as a summary statement, that no events above a 2 can go undetected in the state at this point. You will note on this slide that we are also depicting seismometers outside the state borders. As I mentioned, events can be detected across state borders, and in some cases, depending on where an event occurs, having seismometers in adjacent states may provide very helpful information for refining the event location and the magnitude. The stations shown across Pennsylvania's borders do not necessarily reflect where all the stations outside of the PA-size network may be found. Event detection is really one part of the regulatory process. A second, equally critical part of the process involves responding to potential induced tectonic seismic events. Processes must be in place for detection and follow-up actions. These processes must identify roles and responsibilities for involved stakeholders. Since the Lawrence County event, DEP has taken a number of steps to ensure such measures are in place. All detectable events are automatically recorded, and email distribution takes place essentially in real time at this point. A waveform analysis, which we talked about before, is completed in conjunction with Penn State University, and this allows DEP to determine if the event is near surface related or if it is a true tectonic event or movement along a fault. If a tectonic event is confirmed, immediate coordination begins with the Bureau of District Oil and Gas Operations to explore for operator activity nearby to the event. A 6-mile search radius is applied once the epicenter for the event is located. If spatial and temporal correlation with oil and gas operations is observed, DEP, of course, has regulatory tools at its disposal for intervening. Now that we have had time to introduce some fundamentals relating to seismic activity, I'd like to return to the discussion of DEP's analysis of the Lawrence County events of April 2016 and the conclusions and follow-up actions that have taken place. Before discussing the components of our investigation, it's important to emphasize that DEP has concluded that the series of seismic events detected on April 25, 2016 in Lawrence County can be related both spatially and temporally with operator activity. This depicted map shows the location of the unconventional wells on the well pad that has been associated with the detected tectonic seismic events. The base map simply depicts the site geology. The red circles show the epicenters or locations on the Earth's surface associated with the events. As the map shows, up to 5 seismic events were recorded by local seismic networks. The nearest well pad was identified as the North Beaver NC development pad. This map shows that 4 wells had been drilled at that location. All 4 wells targeted the Utica Shale Formation and have an approximate depth of 7,900 feet below ground surface. Well stimulation or hydraulic fracturing activities had commenced at the North Beaver NC development well pad on March 30th of 2016. Hydraulic fracturing had already been completed at the 2 wells that are drilled to the southeast. At the time of the seismic events, the operator was hydraulically fracturing the laterals oriented to the northwest using a technique known as zipper fracturing. Upon notification by DEP, Hilcorp, who is the operator of the wells, immediately and voluntarily stopped all ongoing activities and later reported they would be discontinuing all hydraulic fracturing and stimulation operations at the well pad indefinitely. Demobilization at the site started at noontime on April 25th. The last recorded event occurred at 2:10 a.m. on the morning of April 26th. It's important to go into a little more detail relevant to the zipper fracturing process, which I referenced on the last slide. This slide has been developed to visually provide those details. The perspective here is looking down on 2 horizontally drilled wells from above. Fracture stages, or individual segments of first one well and then the adjacent well, are hydraulically fractured. This visually resembles a zipper working its way back from the toe of the well to the heel, where the last stages are stimulated. The critical point why we bring this up now is because this type of stimulation technique creates a more expansive pressure influence zone within a hydraulically fractured formation. As you recall from previous slides, pressure is one key factor potentially contributing to induced tectonic seismic events. We will use the next few slides to talk a little bit about the structural geology in the area surrounding the Lawrence County seismic events, and also the significance of DEP's observations in this regard. The well site is located north of a prominent geologic feature known as the Rome Trough. As the name implies, the Rome Trough represents an area of increased accommodation space for overlying sediment units. These sedimentary units are where the oil and gas deposits occur. So essentially this Rome Trough forms an elongate depression that runs from the southwest to the northeastern part of the state. The basin sediments are thicker in association with the Rome Trough, but if you move to the northwest toward the well site where the incident occurred, the vertical offset distance between the Utica Shale and the crystalline basement rock decreases in a fairly pronounced way. This means that operators targeting the Utica Shale northwest of this feature would be executing hydraulic fracturing much closer to brittle basement rock. As we mentioned earlier in the presentation, separation between the Utica Shale and the basement rock is on the order of about 2,500 to 3,000 feet in the area where the events were detected. The well site is situated near an existing deep-seated structural feature known as the Blairsville Broadtop Lineament. This is another point that we'll spend a little bit of time on. Lineaments, which are essentially linear trending features in geology, often present underlying structural features such as fault systems. This figure shows the location of the Rome Trough relative to where the seismic events took place. The depth of crystalline basement rock north and west of this feature decreases and may make this area more prone to induced seismic activity. This slide shows the projected location of the Blairsville Broadtop Lineament, along with several other southeast, northwest trending lineaments and mapped fault systems in the region. As DEP completed its analysis of the Lawrence County seismic events, it chose to publish a formal report inclusive of recommendations aimed at mitigating the risk associated with induced seismicity. I just want to emphasize that these are currently the agency's recommendations. At this time, these recommendations apply to Hilcorp development in the reference townships. The agency does plan to use this general framework as the foundation for a more comprehensive regulatory program referred to as an area of alternative methods for Utica Shale development. This type of rulemaking permits DEP to make area-specific regulations in certain parts of the state that are differentiated by unique conditions. These recommendations form a draft stoplight policy. Stoplight policy sets certain criteria that prompt action aimed at mitigating risk. As the slide shows, the recommendations are inclusive of ongoing local seismic monitoring, which is even more protective than reliance on the public PA-SIZE network. Further, it is recommended that all detectable events within 6 miles of any well bore path for the well being stimulated be reported to DEP within 10 minutes electronically and by phone within 1 hour. Research thus far has shown that induced tectonic seismic events typically show succession of multiple smaller magnitude events prior to larger magnitude events. And so DEP has also recommended that any succession of 3 events over a 3 consecutive day period and between magnitudes of 1.5 and 1.9 inclusive trigger notification and intervention, including the suspension of activities and submission of a seismic mitigation plan. These events must be within 3 miles of the wellbore path for any well being stimulated for this provision. Some additional recommendations that were made. If any event of 2 or greater is detected within a 3-mile distance surrounding a wellbore path for a well being stimulated, it is recommended the operator notify DEP in accordance with the previously established schedule and also discontinue hydraulic fracturing and flow the well back to receive pressure. Submittal of a seismic mitigation plan and all seismic data should follow, and operations should not continue until authorized by DEP. A key provision of the stoplight procedure associated with these recommendations involves keeping induced seismic events below a magnitude that can be felt at the surface. Recall the earlier foundational material that noted microseismic events, which are earthquakes on the Richter scale below a magnitude of 3, in most cases can't be felt and cannot cause damage at the surface. DEP has also recommended that the practice of zipper fracturing for wells that are separated by less than 1/4 mile be discontinued for the reference townships. The plan is to condition future permits in the reference townships with these recommendations moving forward. It's important to note that DEP has approved a seismic monitoring plan submitted by Hilcorp that adopted the recommendations included in this presentation. To sum up on where we are going with all this important work, I think it's important to emphasize that as the science and understanding of induced seismic events continues to advance, we as an agency plan to refine our regulatory focus to ensure that risk mitigation framework in place is current and as effective as it possibly can be. As I mentioned previously, the agency plans to reference the recommendations included in the Lawrence County report as it looks to develop an area of alternative methods for Utica shale development. Standard operating procedures that allow for prompt intervention by both DEP and operators will be the natural byproduct of this effort. It's important to remind all stakeholders that this is a developing science, and as the understanding of the science changes, recommendations, associated rules, policy, and guidance must be readily adaptable. We now reiterate our commitment to protecting Pennsylvania's environment. Earthquakes of any kind are something that we are paying very close attention to, and we are continuously working to expand our capacity to monitor how these activities could be affecting portions of Pennsylvania, even those portions of the state that are miles below the surface. This is a very important issue and one that we will continue to monitor closely. I appreciate everyone's time and attention this morning and would now like to turn the presentation back over to Mr. Shader for a few closing remarks before we open up the event for questions posed by members of the press.
Thank you, Seth. We will now be opening the floor to questions from accredited media only. Reporters on the call, please type in your questions in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner. Please remember to list your name and the media that you are affiliated with in that. We're going to start with a question from Debbie Wachter from the Newcastle News. When were the recommendations handed out to Hilcorp, and are they complying so far?
So the recommendations were part of an ongoing development process, and these were approximately handed out here in the September-October timeframe. And so far, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Hilcorp is complying with these recommendations. In essence, they have submitted a seismic monitoring and mitigation plan that was consistent with the recommendations, and that was approved by the agency. And there has been one permit issued in one of the reference townships, and we applied the recommendations as permit conditions.
Thank you. Next question comes from Laura Legier of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Could the operator have avoided this situation if it had applied lessons learned from hydraulic fracturing-related seismic events in other states?
So I think it's important to step back and look at seismicity overall. I think one thing that we need to be very clear about to address this question is that seismicity, earthquakes, responding to earthquakes, has an element of event detection and then appropriate response. And so what I'm suggesting here is that there is a certain element of risk mitigation that is responsive in nature rather than something that can be anticipated. As our report suggests, there were no significant, there were no faults that were actually identified along the portions of the wellbore where these seismic events were detected, and I think that's another important consideration. So although the compilation of observations suggests that there's a relationship here between the event, the event and the operator activities, this again gets back to that idea of, are we able to definitively predict ahead of time where an induced seismic event will occur? And I don't think that's something that's easily done, and so we approach this from a risk mitigation process. Where are areas that are more susceptible, and how can we respond to curtail events efficiently and effectively?
Question from KDKA asking if Hilcorp will continue to operate in Lawrence County and if there will be additional seismic events from that operation.
So we mentioned in our review here today that we have these recommendations, and we also mentioned that there's a specific area of application where these recommendations will apply. And so that is the agency's short-term intent, and it's already being implemented. As I mentioned for one of the previous questions, we have added conditions, which are essentially requirements to a permit. And so those conditions that we're adding follow this stoplight procedure, which I talked about earlier. And the significance of a stoplight procedure, it allows early event detection, especially if you consider the thresholds that we've established, 2 or being the maximum threshold. It's not a felt event, but it allows for early detection and early response. Essentially, everyone knows what they need to do next. And so if we get back into this issue, looking at the science, the science of predicting earthquakes, the timing of earthquakes is something that's been studied, many, many years for obvious reasons. And so we want to look at this from what is the necessary conservative safety net that needs to be in place. So if a low magnitude event does occur, we can, again, stop our operations, evaluate it, see if there's a relationship, and decide what the most effective plan is to move forward.
Thank you, Seth. Question from Leslie Pappas from Bloomberg DNA. When did Hilcorp implement this plan, and what happens if they don't fully follow through with it?
Because we have condition of permit, those conditions are essentially requirements that apply. And so, if they're not followed, this becomes a compliance and enforcement issue. I think we're going to take some time to get back with you on the specifics of the exact timing of when the report or the seismic monitoring mitigation plan was submitted to the agency. That was something that came into our district colleagues in the Meadville office. But the plan was submitted. It was consistent with our recommendations, and it was approved. And again, the follow-up, we conditioned the well permit in a manner that was consistent with our recommendations as well.
Question from Reed Frazier of the Allegheny Front. Will you change the process of permitting deeper Utica wells to establish a minimum vertical difference from underlying basement geology?
So we're in the process right now, as I mentioned, of developing what we call an area of alternative methods. The simplest way to look at this is it's a field rule. It allows the agency to look at conditions throughout the oil and gas producing regions of the state, and it allows us to develop regulations that apply specifically in those areas. That is more of a long-term plan, and so we've already begun to evaluate where this area of application might exist. And of course, one of the things we're looking at is that offset vertical distance between the Utica shale and the basement rock. These provisions that we're looking at, these regulatory provisions, the data supports that we would only be focusing on the Utica shale. I think another important point here that we want to emphasize is that, we now have 41 seismic stations across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and some nearby ones in adjoining states. So again, we have high resolution detection capabilities, and every single day that the agency's on the job, we are able to get reports of events that have occurred in real time, and we're able to look at the nature of those events and determine whether or not they might be related to operator activity. And in fact, that's the process that we have in place right now. So even if the development of a regulation takes a little bit longer, we do have interim procedures in place right now where we can respond to tectonic seismic events in the state.
A question from Maria Gabriel of KDKA Radio. Are you concerned there could be larger seismic events with the current hydraulic fracturing that is taking place now, not just in Lawrence County, but in other areas of the state as well?
As we talked about earlier in the presentation today, the webinar, we went back and we looked at areas that are susceptible to natural seismic events. This is one important factor that you have to look at when you're considering whether or not there's a potential for an induced event. You know, the earthquake process does not change between induced tectonic seismic events and tectonic events that are natural. There's a man-made action that prompts these induced tectonic events. And so the history in Pennsylvania is that it's a relatively quiescent state with regard to seismicity. And so when you look at these things like fault orientation, natural stress field, I know this gets a little bit more technical. What history tells us is that in Pennsylvania, we don't have an environment that is where we often see earthquakes that are high magnitude, that are in fact above 3. Those sort of events have not been detected in the historical record often, and that historical record, at least dating back to 1970, is pretty robust with the seismic stations that were in place.
Question from Jameson Coughlin of Natural Gas Intelligencer. Will the recommendations be adopted as permit conditions for other operators in the area?
If there were to be another operator developing Utica wells in the reference townships, these permit conditions would be adopted as well, yes.
We've got a question about if Hilcorp has begun activity on the sites with the new recommendations, where the new recommendations are applied. That would be a question for Hilcorp in terms of what their operations are. Question from Rachel McDevitt with Radio PA. Will the stoplight procedure apply to other operators across the state?
So this gets back to our long-term and short-term plans. And long-term, when we develop an area of alternative methods, we have to look at specific characteristics of these areas. And if we identify areas where tailored regulations should be applied, then we'll develop that regulatory language, and they will apply to operators in those portions of the state.
Question from the Newcastle News. Have these seismic events occurred elsewhere in PA where there is drilling?
So there was a very intensive study conducted by Penn State University after the network. There had at least been temporary stations that were put in place throughout Pennsylvania, much more than were ever historically present in the Commonwealth. And the findings of that study are now published on the web. And it was a 22-month-long study that took place between 2013 and 2014. And one key finding was that none of the events detected could be correlated with operator activities, hydraulic fracturing specifically.
Question, what about permitting conditions in the other areas? Would they apply outside of these 3 townships in Lawrence County?
This gets back to our long-term plan again, and so in time, when the area of alternative methods is developed, it won't be necessary to apply permit conditions because there will be an area-specific application where regulatory language applies for all drilling permits. So in the interim, as I mentioned before, we have a robust public seismic network, and we will continue to apply our internal procedures for monitoring events detected by that network and responding to them appropriately.
Question from KDKA Radio. Is the zipper fracturing the main cause of these seismic events?
When we look at these events, we have to look at all of the data that's available in a holistic sort of sense, and so that's what we've spoken about in the report and during the course of this presentation today. And so what we mentioned specifically about zipper fracturing is that you're essentially holding elevated pressure over a larger portion of the subsurface, and so that is a possible contributing factor, but it's just one factor in the scope of a number of different data that were considered.
A question from Laura Legier, the Post-Gazette. Do you suspect that there was a so far unknown fault below the Lawrence County seismic event? If not, what other geologic conditions could have caused the small quakes?
As a general note, faults and movement along faults do result in seismicity, in earthquakes. And so if you look at Pennsylvania, and I'm sure if you look at other states, there are databases of mapped faults. Those faults were mapped using various mechanisms. There may be some geophysical techniques that are applied. There may be mapping at the surface. And so this really comes down to a question of resolution. Are the available sort of techniques for mapping faults, how high resolution are they? So because of the nature of the event, because of the magnitude of the events in Lawrence County, it certainly seems possible that there may be a small fault in this area that was activated as a result of hydraulic fracturing. So I think that's why you have to step back and look at all the contributing factors or potentially contributing factors when you make an evaluation. Any one of those factors may be absent or apparent as a result of that analysis.
Question from Debbie Wachter at the Newcastle News. So does that mean that the Lawrence County event is the only instance where operator activity has caused a seismic event thus far?
So what we should say here is that there is a spatial and temporal relationship with operator activity and the events that were recorded in Lawrence County. And what we can say based on the data that's out there and available and has been assessed most recently by Penn State there in their 2013 and 2014 study is that at least within Pennsylvania, this is the first time when we have seen that sort of spatial and temporal correlation with operator activity.
Thank you, Seth. I'd like to thank all the participants today, including Secretary McDonald, Seth Polepko, and folks on the phone who took the time to call in and learn more about this event. As you can see on the screen, we do have the link to the DEP website where all of the information about this event is, I believe it's up already. If not, it will be soon. That will include the slides from this presentation, which are already up, and a recording of this webinar, including the question and answers, as soon as we can get it processed and uploaded. Thank you again for your participation, and have a great weekend.